Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin day 4, which is our last day on Unit 5.1. And specifically we're going to be looking how the Enlightenment affected societies over time, specifically looking at the topic of abolition. All right. So just as a little claim activity that we had done in the last class, right, the last session, is we looked at this selection from Mary Wollstonecraft from her Vindication of the Rights of Women. And I also put a video from the Freemanpedia, which looks at Olympia de Gorges, which is the, her piece in which this is a reaction to. So I would highly recommend you watch that as well, just for some additional information. But let's just kind of break this down real quick. So the main idea here, women should be educated the same way as men, not just women should be equal. And the idea that women are rational creatures, belief in gender equality. Also there's some building here of some of the structural challenges that women would have to overcome, during this time frame that are being built in this selection as well. So, all right. So let's get into abolition. And of course, when we talk about abolition, we need to talk about this in two different ways. One is the abolition of the slave trade, and the other thing is the abolition of the institution of slavery, because they don't happen simultaneously, right? They don't happen at the same time. So we're going to start real quick by looking at abolition, referring to the actual trade. Right, or the importation into colonies. So here we have a map, and it breaks down for you some dates of when the abolition of the actual importation of enslaved people took place. And we can see here one of the later dates is in Brazil, and 1807 for the United States. And we see up here Denmark in its colonies in 1792. So I did some research on that, and I found out that is when the law was passed, but it didn't actually go into effect until 1803. So 1803 for the Danish colonies in the Caribbean. Okay, so but this is a breakdown of that. Okay, of the trade. Right, so abolition in that context. All right. As far as the abolition to actually get rid of the institution itself, or to get rid of the trade, right? Because you look here, England is 1807. England is a major player in the slave trade, and so how does England go from being a major player to abolishing the trade in 1807? I think an easy way to look at this topic is to look at the story behind the song Amazing Grace. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a pretty interesting documentary, or not documentary, but a piece that has been put together. So we're going to watch this. It takes about 14 or so minutes. So I'm just going to put this on, and that's it.
The time was late December 1772. The place was Old New England, a small country town 60 miles north of London. The 47-year-old pastor, a former slave ship captain by the name of John Newton, needed a song for his New Year's Day service. He needed a song that would inspire the working people of his congregation after their Sabbath rest as they went back to lives of toil and hardships. A song simple people could connect with, heartfelt words that would stir the soul. Reverend Newton had already chosen the scripture for his sermon from 1 Chronicles 17, where King David looks back on his life and asks God with wonder, "Who am I that thou hast brought me here?"
And he sent to his congregation that Friday morning, 1st of January 1773. The Lord gives us many blessings, but unless we are grateful for these, we lose much of the comfort from them. So he said, well, never mind, David, now, what about you and me? When you look back, where were you when the Lord found you? And for himself, he says, I'm the wretch.
The first word of the hymn, grace. No, not just grace. Amazing grace. Yes, that sounded right. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound.
He loved to learn from his mother, and he could recite passages of scripture in all of Isaac Watts' hymns. But when his mother died, his father was away at sea for a year. When he came back, he married quite quickly to a young Italian lady, and they went to live in Essex. They had a child, and Newton rarely got pushed aside.
As a crew member on several slave ships, he helped scour the African coast in search of human cargo. Even the young Newton was thrown into chains once and forced to work as a slave himself on a small island off the coast of Sierra Leone. Eventually released from his captivity after about a year, the great blasphemer, as he called himself, went into a life so depraved that even his rough shipmates found it shocking. What a wretched life I lived, and was saved from it. Yes, put that in, that saved a wretch like me. How far I was from God and the life he intended for me. I once was lost.
From time to time, Newton would make some attempts to get back to the faith that his mother had brought him up in. He would have times of prayer. He would even have times of fasting. But it was like a yo-yo, really. He was up and down all the time. He had no companion to help him, and he certainly didn't seek out any.
Finally, on March 21st, 1748, Newton experienced what he would call his great turning day. In the middle of the night, the 22-year-old was awakened by a violent storm. Cries from his crewmates on deck sounded the alarm. Their ship, the Greyhound, was about to sink. As Newton scrambled up the ladder to the deck, the man directly above him was hit by a wave, swept overboard, and never seen again. Finally, making it to the wheel, the great blasphemer raised his voice not to curse God, but to pray. In words he had not used for many years, John Newton pleaded, Lord, have mercy on us. Hour after hour, sustained only by his call upon God's mercy, Newton attempted to steer the battered ship through the violent seas as down below, the crew sought desperately to stop the holes with bedding and strips of clothing. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear. For 11 hours as the storm raged, Newton remained at the ship's wheel, not knowing if he would live or die. Gradually the winds lessened and the storm began to calm. Newton's desperate prayer for God's mercy had been answered. And grace, my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. For the rest of his life, Newton would mark each March 21st with a day of humiliation, prayer, and praise for his great deliverance from the sea and the life of sin he had been living. Newton's dramatic conversion set him on a long, winding path that would take him towards a new life, not in one great leap, but step by step.
It was through this experience at sea and his prayer, crying for mercy, that Newton's life began to be completely transformed. It wasn't a sudden overnight change, although some things happened immediately. He stopped blaspheming. He didn't swear again, and he began to read the Bible. But looking back later in life on this experience, he said, surely if I had any light then, it was as the first faint streak of dawn.
Captain Newton came home from the sea to stay in 1754. He was 29, and it would be 18 years before he wrote his most famous of hymns. During this time, he grew in faith and knowledge as he learned both Hebrew and Greek. He also became friends with prominent preachers of the day, among them George Whitefield and John Wesley. Church leaders in the area gradually heard about Newton's amazing story and invited him to speak. The idea that Newton might have a higher calling was mighty. He decided to apply for formal ordination.
with all the teaching that Newton was receiving from people like George Whitefield and John Wesley and his many Christian friends in the independent churches, he was rapidly growing as a Christian, and he began to exercise pastoral gifts. He felt that he could do more in the Church of England, the established church, but he wasn't accepted. He applied and was turned down. Finally, Lord Dartmouth was able to get him in a great rush and get the Bishop of Lincoln to ordain him and gave him the living of the church and only. His authentic narrative, the letters about his experience up until that point, were published. And what is very interesting, coming back to this theme of slave trading, is that this book was so popular, it went through many editions, and it was translated into French and German and Dutch. So it went around the world, but nobody ever questioned the slave trading issue, because at that stage, nobody was questioning it anyway.
Pastor John Newton dipped his quill again. How could he sum up his long journey? Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. How could he make it clear that this grace was not a one-time experience, but something that was with him every moment of every day? His grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. In the years after writing Amazing Grace, Newton moved to a larger, more influential post as pastor in a church in London's financial district. The former slave ship captain went on to not only renounce slavery, but work actively to abolish it. 19 years before his death, the aging Newton would publish his Thoughts on the African Slave Trade. His harrowing eyewitness account of the appalling conditions on slave ships and the brutal atrocities practiced on slaves provided abolitionists like his young parliamentarian friend William Wilberforce with powerful evidence they needed to educate a misinformed public.
He gave Wilberforce advice that was profoundly important for his future career. Wilberforce was in the throes of what some scholars have called the Eusebian temptation. That is, do I throw over politics for the ministry? Do I do the holy thing and take up holy orders? Well, think with the hindsight we have of history, what would have been lost for the cause of human rights had Wilberforce left the political arena. Newton said, no, you stay in Parliament, keep up your friendship with the Prime Minister William Pitt. And then he invoked the wonderful Old Testament language of the Book of Esther, saying, who knows that for such a time as this, God has raised you up for the good of the church and the good of the nation. Well, in that case, there really was a prophetic word in play. And God gave that word to Newton. He shared it with his young friend. Wilberforce stayed in politics. Within 2 years, Wilberforce would take up the fight to abolish the slave trade. But it gets even better than that. When we were working on the film Amazing Grace, the thing that was so remarkable is that we know that Newton was with Wilberforce on that Sunday, October 28, 1787, when he wrote in his diary, God has placed before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of my country's manners, that is, the work of cultural renewal and reform. Newton was with him on that Sunday. And so for Wilberforce to sit down, take quill pen in hand, dip it in the inkwell, and write that diary entry, we can lay a lot of the inspiration for Wilberforce finally settling upon that resolve at Newton's door.
As Newton approached death, his eyesight and memory began to fail. One by one, those who had loved him came to say their goodbyes. To one of these close friends, William J., Newton made his now famous declaration, "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things, that I am a great sinner, and that Christ is a great Savior." He died in 1807 at the age of 82, 9 months after witnessing the answer to many prayers, the successful passage of the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. In the years following Newton's death, his song would have an amazing journey. In its original form, the hymn was all but forgotten in England, but nearly a half century after it being written, Amazing Grace began to appear in the American South being sung to a different tune from the original melody. This new music, the one which today seems to be so much a part of the hymn that we cannot imagine it otherwise, gave Newton's simple words a new power and life. It became the vehicle needed to take the song around the world.
There are two thoughts about where the tune for Amazing Grace came from. One is that it may have been a tune used by the slaves in the American South, but the other is that it may have been a tune brought across from Scotland by the early settlers. And I'm more inclined to go with that because Dr. Bruce Hindmarsh has gone into that very carefully, linking the tune with tunes used by the shape note singers.
Performed by popular musicians as well as pipes and drums, Amazing Grace has become one of the most beloved melodies in history. It was sung by freedom marchers and civil rights movements in the American South, and before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. It was sung with rejoicing in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and in Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. It was sung to comfort a mourning nation after the attacks on 9/11. The story of Amazing Grace reminds us that the same grace that transformed the life of a slave ship captain nearly 3 centuries ago can still change lives today. The true story of Amazing Grace is a story that continues. And as long as there are people in need of hope and deliverance, it will have no end.
All right. So, in talking about abolition, right? So, talking about abolition, abolition of the trade itself is one angle of this, and of course, once England does abolish the actual trade, you're going to see England working in the Atlantic to try to slow down the trade. So they don't just stop it for them; they try to stop it, and they are moderately successful. And by moderately successful, if you remember back when we first kind of introduced the Atlantic slave trade, we had this this image of the ships that was running from the point of departure in Africa to its destination in the Americas, and we watched that video go all the way up until the 1860s, which is when it cuts off, and then of course it goes beyond that because we've got 1888 over here in Brazil. So it's the ending of the abolition of the trade itself by the British. Will stop it for some English vessels, just like the abolition of the importation of slaves into the United States stops it for some American ships. But some are gonna illegally smuggle humans in, right? So, and of course, where we live down here on coastal Georgia, there's that very famous example of the Wanderer, as late as 1859, is when the Wanderer comes into St. Andrew's Sound on the southern tip of Jekyll Island. So the banning of or the abolition of the trade doesn't necessarily 100% end the slave trade, right? But it is, it is one of these steps. And of course, when we talked about, the importation of enslaved Africans coming into British colonies officially comes to an end in 1807. But that is separate from the institution of slavery, right? So in the case of England, the institution of slavery in its colonies will be abolished in 1833, all right? So with the Slavery Abolition Act, right? So, and one other kind of just note about this, so the actual abolishment of slavery itself in the empire, we see this here. So this is a more modern quote, just kind of talking about this. In 1833, the British government used 20 million pounds, or 40% of its national budget, to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. That amount of money borrowed for the Slavery Abolition Act was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that living British citizens help pay to end the slave trade. So this is from the British government, trying to kind of talk proudly of modern British citizens, helping to pay off the official end of slavery in the British colonies. And then, of course, you've got a counterpiece to this by The Guardian saying the government certainly shelled out £20 million in 1833, not to free the slaves, but to line the pockets of the 46,000 British slave owners as recompense for losing their, quote, property, unquote. Having grown rich from the profits of an obscene trade, slave owners grew richer still from its ending. And this is one of these situations where these slave owners get paid. When slavery comes to an end. We see this a couple times. We see this in England, and we'll talk about this as well when we talk about Haiti. When Haiti gets its independence in 1804, it won't officially be recognized by France until I believe the date's 1825. And part of that arrangement to be recognized as a sovereign country is that they must pay back the French slave owners who had lost property. All right. So abolition, all right, and so 1833 is the date of the British ending slavery in their empire. In the United States, right, we see the Civil War is the official end in the United States, and you have a variety of reasons why people oppose it. Morally, economically, undercuts. Undercuts people who do not use slavery, prefer the use of cheap labor. And of course, if you're talking about the moral reasons, right, the moral argument is a very strong argument. There's another little video link, which sometimes I show in class. I'm not going to show it here because I just showed you the full video there. This is another video dealing with abolition, and you're welcome. It's just, if you Google history abolition movement, it's right here, and talks about the abolition movement specific to the United States. Okay, so it's a good video. It is a nice overview of the topic. So so it's a video right there. All right, and I've already gone over these. We went over these when we were talking about reactions to slavery. All right, so as far as why slavery does get abolished, you do have your moral reasons, but you also have a number of revolts, which occur, hundreds of revolts that occur. Let me just show you this link here as well. I think this is put on by PBS. It is, and they break down a couple of examples of slave rebellion in the United States, as examples of resistance against it. So Stono, New York City conspiracy, Gabriel's conspiracy, the German Coast uprising. And I'll probably mention this when we talk about the Haitian Revolution and the aftermath of it. And, of course, Nat Turner's rebellion, right? Which saw probably one of the most severe counter-reactions against it. All right, so if you're talking about abolition of slavery, you can also make the connection to the abolition of serfdom in Russia, which occurs in 1862 as well. And but what we see if we're talking about the abolition of slavery, this also gets intertwined with global migration patterns, because if you kind of look at some of this data sets here, change in average annual sugar production, right, pre-abolition of slavery in much of the Caribbean, and post-abolition of slavery in much of the Caribbean. And when do these colonies reach pre-emancipation or abolition of slavery levels? You see that there is that there is a gap, right? But in some of these, you do see a recovery to pre-slavery levels. And for the countries that do regain pre-slavery or pre-emancipation levels, how do they do so? And the answer to that is global migration patterns. So what do we mean by that is we see a substitution of slavery with indentured servitude, right? So a new form of coerced labor. And it's not brand new. This is a form of coerced labor that had been around for hundreds of years. It's practiced in the earliest days of the American colonies. But we see an adaptation of indentured servitude during this era. So here's an infographic from 1858 showing you global migration patterns, right? And what exactly is going on, right? Or a different infographic, right? Looking at global migration patterns and where people are moving to. So, right? So what we're seeing here is a substitution of migration from Africa into the Caribbean to a migration from South Asia into the Caribbean. All right. So indentured servitude or indentured servants, will then work in the sugarcane plantations, the coffee plantations in the Caribbean. All right. So it's a substitution, right? A new form of coerced labor. Also in the American South, we see convict labor on the rise following the abolition of slavery. And I teach in South Georgia, and having taken tours of the Okefenokee swamp, you are touring around on canals that were dug by convict labor, amongst other sources, for logging industry. All right, so convict labor, right, as a substitute. All right. As far as today, connections to today, and we'll talk about slavery later on as well. The last country in the world to abolish it was in 1981. And this is in West Africa, in Central West Africa here in Mauritania. And we see the year that slavery becomes a crime was in 2007. So it was abolished in 81, becomes a crime in 2007. And as of a couple of years, it was like 2 years ago, or probably like 2018 or so, when I pulled this image, there'd been one conviction against a slave owner. And on this site I pulled this from, it breaks down the ethnic groups, right, in Mauritania. Okay. And then this is one of these, right, a more subjective thing is, how much slavery still exists in the world today. So I pulled this from I guess it's the Walk Free Foundation, and according to them, estimates of around 30 million people today are enslaved still to this day. So in the United States, in the neighborhood of 60 million or so people are not free. So this is continuity and change, right? Continuity and change. All right, so let's quick do debrief. Topic 5.1. So what is the Enlightenment? Right, you can pause and skim through this. I guess the addition to today is the coerced labor, right? We see new forms of coerced labor once we see the abolition of slavery. So indentured servitude, convict labor, the Kangani system, which we'll talk about later on as well, because it's more of a Indian Ocean specific concept. All right. Major effects of the Enlightenment. We see the application of these ideals having an effect on women's suffrage, the abolition of slavery, serfdom, other forms of coerced labor, and the adoption of, or the intensification, I guess, since, indentured servitude is not new. All right. So that is it for today. Sapriani.